In the last video, I mentioned that there's a lot of news at the moment, a lot of things that would be worth talking about, and that's certainly true. We saw the tragedy in the Channel. Another 12 migrants drowned yesterday. It's one of the worst incidents on the Channel in recent years. No doubt that's going to become, unfortunately, that's going to happen more and more. Um, but for this video, I'll save talking about that. But I'm just mentioning in passing because that is the other big news story at the moment. There was also a case of an elderly man in Leicester murdered by children. Horrible, horrible situation. I may make a video on that, I may not. But I'm just mentioning these things because they're the sort of news items that are on my mind at the moment, as is this one regarding Israel and Gaza. So, double page in the eye about this story. I'll just show you. This is today's eye. The other story they're covering is the Grenville inquiry. But anyway, the 4th of September, this is the double page coverage. I know there's the light is not ideal there, but if I put it any closer to the light, then there'll be a glare. So anyway, double page coverage. What I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to actually read out a piece by Patrick Cockburn, who is a well-established authority on the Middle East, and I've got a couple of books by him. It's fair to say, like his friend Robert Fisk, he's quite critical of the West, but he certainly has plenty of experience, and he knows what he's talking about. I think it would be a foolish young journalist to argue with someone like Patrick Cockburn, put it that way. But the development is basically we have a limited reduction now or cancellation on arms to Israel. Um, in a way, this is a no-win position for Starmer on the domestic front. This before I get into the report or into the op-ed, um, because the left are going to say it doesn't go far enough, and the right are going to say it's a betrayal of Israel. So it's kind of a no-win position for Starmer and Lammy. But this is Patrick Cockburn's take. He supports it. I'm going to read this out and then cover a few other aspects of this. It goes without saying, just before I get into this, I think that the, the global opinion on this is clear, and that is that what Israel is doing in its military campaign is just appalling. It's killing and wounding thousands and thousands and thousands of Palestinians. It's just there's no way to gloss this over. Even if you go for more conservative figures, it's appalling, and it's increasingly difficult to just blindly support Israel in terms of it being a self-defense war. I would also say before I get into this report, there will be people who draw analogies between Ukraine and Israel, and I would say that there are fundamental differences. I mean, with Ukraine and Israel, in both cases, you had both countries under attack. In the case of Ukraine, it was Russia's invasion. In the case of Israel, it was the atrocities of October the 7th. But the response is that, for the most part, Ukraine has been fighting a defensive war in its own territory. The Kursk incursion recently, like I say, has had minimal civilian casualties. And I do think if there were to be mass Russian casualties, that would not be good. It would make things difficult for Ukraine's allies, but that hasn't been the case. Now, by contrast, Israel's defensive campaign in Gaza, not in Israel itself, has been incredibly costly to civilians. For me, this isn't just a sentimental sort of soundbite. This is a very fundamental thing. Um, and I do get quite angry at the desensitization about Palestinian civilians from pro-Israelis. Um, I think that's palpable. Britain and America are the only countries in the world that seem to give Israel blind support. Most other Western countries don't. There was recently a falling out with the Japanese, or more specifically, the city government in Nagasaki, because there was going to be a commemoration for the anniversary, the 79th anniversary of the end of World War II. And the British and American ambassadors decided to grandstand and not turn up because the Israeli ambassador wasn't invited. Now, this is, I thought, a big mistake. Firstly, it's not for Britain and America to dictate to Japan who should be there and who shouldn't. Secondly, Japan's an ally. Yes, so is Israel, but I am uneasy about this notion there should just be blind support for one country. I wouldn't even say there should be blind support for Ukraine, although I'm staunchly supportive of Ukraine. If Ukraine, for example, if there was mass Russian casualties involved in their incursion into Kursk, that wouldn't sit well with me. Put simply, I'm against civilian casualties in war. I don't think civilians are ever a legitimate target. And what Israel is doing, they could say they're going after Hamas, but inevitably the number of deaths here are just becoming unconscionable. Anyway, this is the piece by Patrick Cockburn. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's angry denunciation of the UK's decision to suspend some arms sales to Israel is shameful, is encouraging evidence that small, though the gesture may be in terms of military equipment, it's having a significant impact. Now, before I continue this, apologies for interrupting the flow. I'm not actually going to read out the whole thing. It is. I'm just realizing in terms of space, I'll abridge this a little bit. Also worth mentioning, there's big protests in Israel against Netanyahu, increasing anger against the approach that he's taking. I think it's clear that most Israelis want the hostages released. They want some sort of deal, and if that means, um, I think for most Israelis, the issue is hostage release more than destroying Hamas. And that may have changed since the start. I think after October the 7th, it was about destroying Hamas, but I think most Israelis now just want the hostages released. It's worth mentioning, and this is really anger at the UK's position comes after the six bodies of those hostages were found. Anyway, I'll continue. Foreign Secretary David Lammy's declaration is being criticised for being too low key and legalistic, but by underplaying the Israeli Defense Forces' well documented onslaught on Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, he gives the UK action a credibility it might not otherwise possess. In terms of UK public opinion, suspending 30 out of 350 export licenses, remember this is a minority of the licenses we send to Israel, for military equipment is far behind what most people would like. A YouGov Medical Aid for Palestine poll at the end of July showed that 58% of respondents support banning sales by the UK of weapons to Israel while the Gaza conflict continues. Just 18% were against doing so. At the most basic level, the government's action is significant because it reminds people that the mass slaughter in Gaza is going on every day, even when it is not in the headlines, and is in danger of becoming a normal feature of the international landscape. Details of the latest additions to the terrible toll of dead and injured are spelled out in unemotional reports by UN agencies every few days. These should be read by everybody. The latest report says that between the afternoons of the 29th of August and 2nd of September, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza, and it has to be said that these bodies are run by Hamas, Hamas has the final say, but nevertheless, 184 Palestinians were killed and 369 were injured. Between the 7th of October 2023 and the 2nd of September 2024, almost a year this conflict's been going on, at least 40,786 Palestinians were killed and 94,224 were injured, according to MOH in Gaza. That's a staggering figure. Um, and even if the true figure is lower, it is abundantly clear that many, many, many civilians have died. Now, recently, the Democrats in the United States have been toughening the rhetoric on the civilian death toll. One reason for that, of course, is because, and I'm going to come back to Cockburn's report in a minute, but Cockburn's piece, I should say. Yeah, the pressure on the Democrats is because a lot of young Muslim Democrats are understandably angry about this, particularly in Minnesota, where I think it has proportionally one of the highest populations. There was, of course, angry scenes outside Chicago. Harris, like Biden, like Obama, like every American president, I'm already calling him president, it is making it clear they support Israel. I don't think any American politician could get to the White House without saying that. Anyway, to continue. But she has called out she has condemned the number of civilians being killed. Of course, for critics of Britain and America's position, it's kind of like, well, you're denouncing the civilian death toll, but you're still supplying Israel with the weapons that kill people. Um, Anyway, to finish Cockburn's report here, the quantity of UK weapons denied to Israel is small, but then the warfare is not between regular armies in Gaza. Instead, it is a bid by Israel to resolve a political problem, the presence of 7 million Palestinians between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea by armed force. This will either fail entirely, turn into an endless war, or escalate into an even more horrific bloodbath. In all three cases, the UK is morally and politically right to keep its distance and do what it can to bring the conflict to an end. I noticed the Trump campaign has been distorting what the British position is. Fred Flight of the Trump campaign says, "Where's the pressure from the British government on Hamas? Where's the outrage from Keir Starmer and David Lammy about the executions?" Well, that's just disingenuous because Starmer and Lammy and Labour have clearly condemned Hamas over and over again, as have every mainstream British politicians. So that's just false, a false claim. In Britain itself, in this country, Claire Short, who of course resigned from the Blair government over Iraq, she has came out by calling for a ban on F-35 jet parts, which is used, I understand, for the bombing. Um, and, Tories, even moderate Tories like Tom Tugendhat, said, let's just be clear what Labour has done. On the day that the Israeli government discovered the bodies of more hostages, on the day that they had to share that news of grief and torment with families, on the very day that we saw the real price of Hamas uh, and the evil extremist violence that they've brought not just to Israel but also to the Palestinian people, on that day the British government decided that it was the right day to stand against Israel's right to defend itself, and that's a remarkable decision. Disappointed in Tugendhat making that statement because I always took him to be a smart man and moderate. For him to simplify it in those black and white terms, what about every day where Palestinian families are wiped out? Is he not thinking about that? I mean, Hamas bears foremost responsibility for the death of hostages, and I would say that Hamas is beyond despicable for the fact that they still will not release the remaining hostages despite what has happened to the Palestinian people. That shows Hamas's true colours. But saying that Hamas is a brutal terrorist organisation should be obvious. One reason I've never sort of joined the pro-Palestinian demo is I am uneasy with the Hamas sympathisers that are to be found in them. I've no time for that. But I'm sick and tired of this idea that criticism of Israel's excesses, criticism of the deaths of Palestinian civilians somehow makes you a Hamas sympathizer, which is pretty much the attitude that Netanyahu takes. Um, Aside from trying to trample free speech, it's just wrong. It's perfectly compatible to believe in Israel's right to defend itself, to be anti-Hamas, but also be deeply concerned and uneasy about the number of Palestinian deaths directly at the hands of Israel's military actions. I mean, they could take out, a refugee camp in an airstrike and kill 90 people, and they might say we killed 25 Hamas terrorists, and that might be true. But does that justify dozens of women and children and non-Hamas men being killed? I mean, for me, the issue here is that it's just this almost desensitization to Palestinian lives. And it's this blind support for Israel coming from the right, frankly, that I think is really unfortunate. Because it's just this attitude of support Israel no matter what. I mean, I don't think any country should have that sort of green light. Adam Bolton's piece is interesting on Boris Johnson. Temperature fraying in this country over the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and the usual suspects are fanning the flames. Yesterday, Boris Johnson posted on X, Hamas is still holding many innocent Jewish hostages while Israel tries to prevent a repeat of the 7th of October massacre. Yeah, but the campaign is clearly the wrong approach. The way they have, even many Israelis believe that, something Johnson isn't recognizing. Why are Lamy and Starmer abandoning Israel? Hardly abandoning Israel because it's only a portion of the weapons that they want Hamas to win. As the former Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary should well know, the answers to his questions are no, they are not, and no. making his announcement to MPs on Monday that the government would be suspending a few arms export licenses to Israel. Foreign Secretary David Lammy described himself as a liberal progressive Zionist who believes in Israel as a democratic state, a public position long held by ministers in both main parties. Now, that's going to infuriate any Islamists who might at one point have supported Labour. So for Johnson to be fanning the flames, which is basically what Adam Bolton is criticising, um, the UK contributes 0.02% to Israel's arsenal, and this suspension affects only 30 of about 350 export licenses. I didn't know it was that low actually. 0.02%, barely anything. Like its predecessors, this Labour government continues to support Israel's right to defend itself and is pledged to join in the defence if there is another missile attack on the country by Iran. Um, Netanyahu's come out and said, Israel provides essential security to Britain. That may be true, but I have a big problem with this idea that because Israel's ostensibly an ally, we should just blindly support them. Let's not forget British civilians have also been killed in Israeli strikes, which the IDF always says, oh, it was a terrible mistake. Every single time it's collateral damage, it was a mistake. Now, Israel has some of the best technology in the world. These mistakes are happening far too much. Um, After October the 7th, I was very much, hardline on it. Israel has to go after Hamas. This is absolutely justified. But I cannot in good conscience say that I'm okay with Palestinian families just being wiped out in airstrikes every single day. Not to mention the humanitarian crisis in Gaza that Israel pathetically denies. Um, anyone with eyes can see that that's going on. I mean, there are certainly bad actors on the ground who are a barrier to peace. I mean, Hamas are toxic, and apparently they even attack aid convoys coming in from Egypt. But on the other side, you have far right Israeli politicians who literally are talking about occupying the whole of Gaza permanently with settlers. So I think the context here is that Netanyahu heads the far right party in Likud. Um, Most Israelis want the hostages out, understandably. I mean, I really, really do have enormous sympathy for the families of those people. It must be horrendous, knowing that there's sexual violence against Israeli women, knowing that what these people will be going through. They're going to need years and years of therapy, I would imagine, probably physiotherapy as well. But again, why is it Palestinian civilians are just regarded as collateral damage? Oh, the price to pay for Israel's security. Israel does have a right to defend itself, but it doesn't have a right to commit war crimes. And absolutely, some of the things that have gone on in Gaza have to be seen as war crimes. I don't see any legitimacy for bombing a hospital, bombing a refugee camp. And I'm aware that Hamas hides among the civilians. Despicable, but with the technology that Israel has, its carpet bombing campaign cannot be the right way to go about this. I actually have far less moral issues with taking out someone like Ishmael Haniyeh, as much as that angers Iran. And some would say, well, it was an attack on Iran's sovereignty because it happened in Tehran. Israel chose that rather than Qatar because Qatar is close to the West, and this is the nature of geopolitics. But the killing of one man, um, who is the head or joint head of a terrorist organization. I have far less issues with that than the wiping out of civilians, en masse. At some point, people have to say, how long can this go on? How long can there just be this impunity for Israel to just kill civilians under the guise of self defense? And they'll always say they regret civilian deaths and that they take maximum efforts to prevent it. I don't believe that. I don't believe Israel's doing everything it can to prevent civilian deaths. And it's this thing about Hamas pointing out what Hamas is. Most people understand that Hamas is a terrorist organization. There's only a minority of Islamists and naive people on the left who think Hamas are the good guys. Um, in the Western context, most people know what Hamas is. Hamas is a prescribed terrorist organization. But I have a big problem with this notion that there should just be blind support for Israel no matter what. It's I think it's wrong-headed. I mean, in a way, Starmer and Lammy can't win because whatever position they take on this, they're going to be criticised. You know, if they completely cut off arms, then the right will be even more um, try to exploit this even more and say, "Oh, Starmer's abandoned Israel. Starmer's pandering to Hamas." I think that's a very cynical distortion of what's happening. Um, but you know, the watered down thing will anger people who think it's not going far enough. Um, so it's a very difficult balancing act. But I don't think that Netanyahu should get this carte blanche from the West to do as he pleases. Um, why? I don't think any country should. Yes, there's the issue of joint intelligence sharing, but I think it's reasonable that when we're supplying weapons, and whilst this is affecting Britain's international reputation, it's undermining our reputation. We talk about democracy in Ukraine, which is very valid, but then people, particularly in the Middle East, will say, well, you're supporting Israel's murder of Palestinian civilians. And you know, you can get into the nuances of they try to avoid it, but in the end of the day, if you're on the ground and you've had your entire family wiped out in an Israeli airstrike, it's a bit void to say, oh, well, Israel's just targeting Hamas. Well, sorry about the collateral damage. I have a big problem with that sort of desensitization to it. And one last thing, and this was brought up in Al Jazeera recently now. There's hypocrisy in what I'm going to talk about because they don't use the same standards for how Islamophobia is used. But I do think there is some truth that anti Semitism sometimes is used as a way to silence legitimate criticism of Israel. There is definitely anti Semitism out there, and no doubt there's pockets of anti Semitism in those pro Palestinian rallies. More than pockets, it's often quite glaringly obvious. But we need to get away from this cynical way of shutting down debate by saying that criticism of Israel amounts to anti-Semitism in of itself. It absolutely doesn't. And academics, activists, critics should have the freedom to criticize Israel. It should be accurate and it should be, um, based on what's happening rather than, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about the Jews. But there's also a point worth bearing in mind that many Jews are critical of Netanyahu's actions. So framing this as criticize Israel or, not give Israel an absolute green light to do as it pleases somehow amounts to being pro-Hamas. It's a dichotomy of, either support Israel 100% or you're pro-Hamas. That is odious. In that case, most of the world is pro-Hamas, which of course isn't true. Um, It's just most of the world sees the Palestinian people being collectively punished. I think it's just going on too far, uh, too long. I mean, telling them, go to a safe haven. There is no safe haven in Gaza. How long can this continue where people are living in rubble and they're just sitting targets of Israeli warplanes? I mean, it can't continue. Hamas certainly bears a lot of responsibility, and despite what Starmer's critics say they have actually been putting pressure on Hamas as well. So that's a false thing to say that it's only a critique of Israel. It's unfortunate it was the same day that those hostages were bound, but frankly, any day the announcement was made, they would have framed it the same way. Um, but I think the government's made the right decision here. I actually think they should go further. Um, Maybe not a 100% ban on everything, but Netanyahu has this mindset that we should just blindly support him. Why? Um, I think any country has a right to know when it's in a trade deal or particularly with weapons, what those weapons are being used for. And if British weapons are playing a part in the deaths of Palestinian civilians, the British government has a right to ask questions about that. And if need be, hold it back. I mean, I don't think this will necessarily diffuse anger against the West, against this country. And of course, there's been a fallout. I mean, no one's going to admit this, but there will be behind the scenes tensions between Washington and London on this. But we are an independent country. We shouldn't kowtow to what America wants or what Israel wants. This is a very fundamental point. Um, So that's how I feel about it. Um, this does not make me a Hamas sympathizer. I think, for example, it's legitimate to take out Hamas's leaders. These are evil, brutal terrorists who don't care about Palestinian deaths, and they certainly don't care about Israeli deaths. In fact, they've actively, it's obvious what they've done to the Israelis in that sense. But we have to get away from this idea that criticizing civilian deaths in Gaza amounts to being pro Hamas. I think that's a dangerous conclusion, actually.